It's still the same family that's been working there for generations after generations.
What are some of the key things that you would want to highlight to them, just so that they would know maybe why it's a region to check out?
Because there are some really amazing wines being made, Rôti, Hermitage, these incredible wines that have been made there for centuries, if not longer, about 2,000 years.
Wine CEO podcast listeners, I am so excited you're in for a treat today. I've been looking forward to this interview. I love wines from the Rhône, but I will admit that it is a very complicated region, like in my opinion, probably one of the most complicated regions in France. And so I've been looking forward to my conversation with Matt Walls. Matt is an expert on the Rhône Valley. He lives in the UK, but he actually moved to the Rhône a few years ago to be able to research and write his book, Wines of the Rhône, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today because it's a phenomenal book. If you don't have this book, you have to go out and get it. He's a contributing editor for Decanter. He is, again, an absolute incredible expert on wine, but specifically the Rhône. And I'm so excited to have him on the show today. So Matt, welcome to the Wine CEO podcast.
Thank you, Sarah. That's nice to be here.
Yes, so happy to have you. So I would love if you could just take a few minutes to tell the listeners about yourself, maybe how you got into wine, and then also what led you down this unique path to specialize in the Rhône.
Yeah, sure. Well, a lot of people kind of, when you ask them this question, how do they get into wine? How do they start working in wine? Often what you hear is that people just fell into it by accident, whatever. I think I'm one of the only people that actually thought to themselves, at university, what am I going to do with my life? Okay, maybe I'm going to work with wine. I think maybe that might be fun. I'm a student. I like drinking. So, and then I just started straight out of university. I got a job in a wine merchant, and then I've worked in wine ever since. So it's partly because I did a French degree. And at the time I thought, well, I ought to use this French degree that I've worked for years on. So what do I like? It's French. So that's kind of the reason why I got into wine. But also, I'd always been into food. I'd worked kind of in kitchens, with some chefing and the like when I was at university. So it kind of makes sense to go in that kind of food wine direction. So that's pretty much it.
I love it. That's great. And then was there a point in the journey where you just kind of fell in love with the Rhône? Did you visit it and decide like, this is the place, I need to know everything about this region?
I think it was a mixture of different things. I think it was tasting some wines which really chimed with me, which I just found absolutely compelling and delicious. I remember the first time I tasted Michel Chapoutier, his single vineyard Hermitage wines called the Sélection Parcellaire. I remember the first time I tasted those, and they were just a revelation to me. It was just a flavor profile that I found so incredibly delicious and really like nothing else on earth as well. And when you discover wines like that you love and you want to visit the region, and then the more you get to know the region, the more you kind of discover. So it becomes a kind of slightly organic process, I suppose.
That's awesome. And I know that the Rhône, it is a complicated region, right? And we're going to get into that in today's show. Between the terroir, the permitted grape varieties, there's so many nuances. And so I think it can be overwhelming for a lot of consumers, right? And so obviously we're going to look to you today to maybe simplify it a little bit for us. But when you take a step back and you just kind of give like an overview to someone who maybe isn't familiar with the Rhône, what are some of the key things that you would want to highlight to them, just so that they would know maybe why it's a region to check out, or what you find most exciting that differentiates it from some of the other regions in France and even around the world?
Okay, well, I suppose in the context of France, when I think about the Rhône, I've visited most of the other kind of famous wine regions of France, and the thing I love about the Rhône is that it's a very soulful region. I think when you go there, the people that you meet, wine is really in their blood. Often if you go to a small domain, you go to a small estate, it's still the same family that's been working there for generations after generations. And when you do go and visit them, you don't meet someone from the marketing department. You don't meet the manager, who's just been flown in from some other country. You're meeting people that own the place. And not only do they own it, but they make the wine, they tend the vines, they do everything. And often it's all within the same family as well. So that's one thing that I really like about it. When you do visit, you really feel like you're kind of plugging directly into this thousands of years of history that's still alive today. And I don't think you always get that with regions around the world. So that's one thing that I particularly love about it. I should probably say right from the off that for me, the Rhône is really two different regions.
Mm.
So you've got the Northern Rhône and you've got the Southern Rhône, and they're really both very different places. So they do share some great varieties, and they share the same river, but apart from that, they're pretty much completely different. Let's start with the Northern Rhône, because the Northern Rhône is easy, right? So, so the Northern Rhône, so when we're talking about the Rhône Valley, we've got the Northern Rhône and the Southern Rhône. So obviously the Northern area is directly north of the Southern bit. And so we're talking about an area here between Lyon and Marseille. So Lyon is kind of halfway down the kind of the east side of France, and Marseille is at the coast. So it's quite a long region. In the north, there are far fewer grape varieties, and it's much, much smaller. So the Northern Rhône makes about 5% of the wine of the Rhône in general. So the south makes 95%. So relatively speaking, it's very small. It gets a lot of airtime because there are some really amazing wines being made. You know, Pet Rôti, Hermitage, these incredible wines that have been made there for centuries, if not longer, about 2,000 years. However, they don't make so much. But when it comes to the north, grape varieties, really easy. So when it comes to the reds, it's all Syrah. When it comes to the whites, it's either Viognier or it's Marsanne and or Roussanne. But they never blend the two. So it's either Viognier by itself or Marsanne and or Roussanne. And the terroir is very, very different to the south as well. So it's very, very kind of sloping. So very, very steep slopes, which makes for a really, really beautiful landscape as well. It's a really stunning place to visit. And so not only is it a really beautiful place to visit, but these slopes have a big impact on the style of the wine. So on the one hand, it helps kind of elevate the wine. So you get a certain amount of altitude in the north, which you don't get so much in the south. But it also, you get different aspects kind of sometimes towards, sometimes off towards the south or more towards the east, depending on kind of where the kinks of the river are, that kind of thing. And it tends to be a little bit greener than the south as well. So the south tends to be a bit more of a kind of beige landscape, particularly in summer. You know, it gets very, very hot, so kind of the grass kind of all dies off. You know, the vines are still green, of course, but it's certainly hotter down there. So it's hotter, it's sunnier, and it's also windier as well. And the wind plays quite a big part when it comes to keeping the vineyards healthy. When it comes to grape varieties, though, so very, very different in the south. So whereas you've only got 4 grape varieties to worry about in the north, down in the south you've got like 24 different grape varieties. So you've got the famous ones are Syrah, Grenache, Mourvèdre. But after that, you have just kind of this enormous smorgasbord of kind of loads of kind of small, kind of pretty much unknown varieties as well. But they can really add a lot of detail, a lot of color, and a lot of kind of local charm, I think, to the wines.
And in the Southern Rhône, that's where we have Châteauneuf-du-Pape, right? Which is probably one of the more well-known, especially for American consumers, regions within the Southern Rhône. And it has a pretty incredible history, but I find a lot of folks don't realize that. I mean, there's how many permittable grapes that can go into Châteauneuf-du-Pape? Is it like 13?
Well, it depends how you count. Okay, so
okay.
yeah, so yes, technically 13, but it's probably closer to 18, right? Because you can count Grenache once, but they can also use, you know, Grenache Blanc. So in fact, that's another variety. You could count Picpoul, which is the white variety, but they can also use Picpoul Noir. They can use Grise. So it depends, like I say, it depends how you count. But yeah, they can use a lot. But the funny thing about Châteauneuf is that if they want to, unlike the rest of the Southern Rhône, they can choose just one grape variety. So if they want to make a pure Mourvèdre, a pure Grenache, or in white, if they want to make a pure Grenache Blanc or pure Claret, they can do that. Whereas for most of the other crus, so like Gigondas and Cuirass, for appellations, generally speaking, they have to blend.
Thank you, Rhône, for keeping it very complicated with a lot of nuances and a lot of caveats to everything. If we're just looking at Châteauneuf-du-Pape for a second, just because we're on the topic, what is so unique about this particular cru within the Southern Rhône? If you can kind of just give us a quick overview of why there's been such incredible heritage for Châteauneuf-du-Pape specifically, and then maybe a little bit of how it impacted the history of like the AOC and things like that.
Yeah, sure. Well, Chateauneuf's been making wine, for hundreds and hundreds of years. It really became more famous when the Pope, who lived at the time in Avignon, which is just a few miles south of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So he decided to make another palace, like his summer palace, in a little town there, because at the time it wasn't actually called Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It was called Châteauneuf-Castaigne. So it's changed its name slightly throughout history. So when the Pope decided to move there and create his enormous, nice new kind of party palace, they like to do a lot of feasting. So they started growing more grapes, making more wine. And the thing about Châteauneuf-du-Pape is it's quite unusual in the way that the name of the appellation actually kind of tells the story as well. So Châteauneuf means Newcastle, and the Pape is the Pope, so it's the Newcastle Pope. So it's really on the back of the Newcastle being built there and the vineyards that were planted there that its fame kind of started to grow. So after that, there were kind of more and more small estates that sprang up. So this was a few hundred years later. But the thing about Châteauneuf, I think one of the reasons why it was so famous is because it travels really well. So they would find that they could export it, as far as England, as far as the States, and the wine would still be good. So, and that's kind of allied to the ageability of the wine as well. Some wines just have this amazing power, to go, this longevity and this life force. And Châteauneuf is one of those wines which can just age and kind of become more and more complex and interesting as it does.
That's awesome. So I think we're keeping it really simple, saying, okay, there's the Northern Rhône and there's the Southern Rhône, but obviously there's a lot we could drill down into, because there's even a lot of like ancillary areas that are on either side of the Southern Rhône that can kind of be more complicated. And then within the Northern and Southern, there's the, village system, there's the cruise. So if you, again, had to kind of simplify for a consumer, what would you say are the key things to think about when you are recognizing the different layers within the Rhône? If you don't want to get too nuanced into all of the different systems, what are some of the kind of high level key points that you would recommend being aware of maybe when you're shopping?
So the whole appellation system in the Rhône, it is a little bit complicated, you're right. So just to give people just a very quick snapshot of how it works. So if on the wine label it says AOC Côte de Rhône, that's like just the generic kind of most basic level of appellation. So they can use loads of different grapes, they can have a big area to grow in, and it makes up about half of the production of Rhône wines. And then as the quality goes up, the rules become a little bit tighter. You can use fewer grapes, it's a smaller growing area, which is a supposedly better growing area. And then you can use Côte de Rhône Village. And then there's the third layer, which is the named villages. So they can use Côte de Rhône Village, and they can put the name of their village on the end. So Côte de Rhône Village Sablé, or Côte de Rhône Village Vison, or something like that. So there are 22 villages which are considered to be extremely good, who are allowed to use their name. And then at the top level, there's the cru. There's the crus. So Châteauneuf-du-Pape is a famous one. But there's 9 in the south and there's 8 in the north. So that's kind of the very top level. So it'll just say something like AOC Gigondas or AOC Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And that's kind of the top level of quality, really.
That's awesome. And I think that's probably the best overview in a really quick, simple snapshot. So thank you. That's awesome. I know there can be pretty big price differences as you're looking around, the Rhône naturally, and you look at like Hermitage, and there's some really incredible wines that are going to go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars and more. But obviously throughout the Rhône, you're going to find some really incredible wines, even at a great price point, that may not necessarily be a cru, right? And so how would you necessarily recommend sifting through, finding some great quality Rhône wines that are not necessarily going to be as well known or extremely expensive because they're, a cru that's very, very well known around the world?
Okay, so we're looking for value.
Yeah, I would say value.
We're also looking for wines which aren't hugely expensive.
Yes.
Okay. I would say that the Rhône in general is you get pretty good value. Generally speaking, the wines of the Southern Rhône tend to be less expensive. However, in the Northern Rhône, if you have a thirst for that really distinctive, spicy, kind of medium-bodied, savory style of Syrah, there are still some good value places to look. So if you're in the north, I would consider looking at, there are some inexpensive wines from Crozes Hermitage, which can be really good. I would also look at Saint-Joseph. So Saint-Joseph is a really big appellation, and within it, there are some really exceptional little granite slopes, which make amazing wines. So I would definitely have a look in Saint-Joseph. There's also the IGP wines, which they used to be called Vin de Pays. So we haven't really touched on those. So there's those as well. In the north, there's one called IGP Colline Rodanière, which basically covers the whole of the Northern Rhône area. So those can be really, really good value. So often it's little slopes which are kind of just close to Condrieu, which is that rich white wine made of Viognier, or perhaps they're very close to Côte Rôtie, or maybe they're just outside of the area. And those can be really inexpensive. So often they'll be more like kind of £15 compared to Saint-Joseph, which might be £25, or Condrieu, which might be 45, £50. So Colline Rodanière, if you're looking for a Northern Rhône style, is a great place to look for value. In the south, it's kind of hard to go wrong, really. I mean, the wines on the whole in the south aren't terribly expensive. Châteauneuf-du-Pape tends to start at around £25, £30. But in the south, I mentioned the Côte du Rhône village that can put the village name at the end. Those can be great value because they're really, really small areas, which generally speaking, they all certainly should have their own character. And they're all kind of really struggling for quality because they want to be moved up to the next level. Right? So when you get moved up to Cru level, you tend to be able to charge more for your wines, and it's really prestigious. So people are really struggling, like trying hard to up their game. So I would look at those 22 named villages. Often in terms of value, there's some really, really good things to find there.
That's awesome. And you mentioned a moment ago, some of the northern typical styles are going to be a bit spicier, right? Because of the heavy Syrah. So how about for the southern? Is there a bit of a standard profile that you're going to find from the Grenache heavy wines, or not necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, you can generalize about the flavor profile of the Southern Rhône a little bit, I think. Generally speaking, in the south, the wine's going to be based on Grenache. So in the Northern Rhône, they don't really blend, unless we're talking about the whites, they sometimes blend a little bit. But in the south, there's a big culture of blending. Almost always, there's going to be a large proportion of Grenache. And it tends to be blended with a little bit of Mourvedre, a little bit of Syrah, and sometimes those other grapes. But generally speaking, we're talking about Grenache, and we're talking about Southern Rhône Grenache. So the profile of Southern Rhône Grenache, it tends to be quite red fruited. So it tends to be more kind of strawberry, raspberry kind of flavors. Sometimes you get some little floral accents, kind of like violet accents. The thing about Southern Rhône Grenache is that it tends to be quite savory as well. So often when you find it grown in other parts of the world, this kind of strawberryish can have a slightly kind of jammy or kind of sweet tinge to it. In the Southern Rhône, it's more likely to have more of a kind of a savory flavor and maybe more of a kind of herbal kind of note to it. They talk about garrigue quite a lot, and what they mean is like wild thyme and wild rosemary. So often you find those kind of notes with the Grenache of the Southern Rhône.
That's awesome. Thank you. And one of the things, I'm going to plug your book here for a second, because one of the things that I loved about your book is that you really went in depth, and it wasn't just about the region, but it really was about specific producers as well, and flavor profile and value, and just so much. So I feel like it's very different than a typical wine book that may not necessarily go into detail with specific producers. And so that's where I'm going to highly recommend, if anyone is traveling to the Rhône or interested in the Rhône or just wanting to try new wines from the Rhône, I feel like you did such an incredible job of highlighting specific producers as well. And so you can almost use it as a bit of like a shopping guide too, to find like what profile you think you might be interested in and then trying it. So I really appreciate the detail that you went into in the book around that.
Amazing, thanks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd love to hear from you is how you feel like the Rhône has maybe changed, if at all, just in the last few years, right? I mean, there's obviously new winemaking techniques that are coming out. We're seeing climate change impact for regions. So what have you seen impacting the Rhône, both man-made and not, in the last, we'll say, couple, years or decades?
I would say, I said the climate is changing. This much is, this is definitely true. It is not only measured, but if you talk to older vignerons as well, they'll often say that they pick much earlier than they used to do, maybe 1 week or 2 weeks earlier. Which is, in the scheme of things, is a pretty big deal. The profiles of wines are slightly changing as well due to climate change. So the summers tend to be hotter, they tend to be much drier. So the amount of rain is kind of pretty much the same as it was before, but it tends to come in big storms, and it tends to come kind of outside of the summer months. So that's what we're seeing in terms of climate change. So yes, there's an impact on the wines. In some ways, it's not all entirely negative. So there are certain areas such as Ventoux. So Ventoux is an area kind of on the outskirts of the main Southern Rhône growing area. And it's a mountain, so it's 1,912 meters high, to be precise. So it's huge, you can see it from everywhere in the Southern Rhône. And increasingly, the wines there are becoming more and more interesting because they're quite high up, there's quite a lot of altitude, they never used to be terribly ripe, maybe 30 years ago, 20 years ago. But now, now the wines are amazing. So it's for me, Ventoux is one of the most exciting appellations in the Rhône now. So at least, in the short term, we're seeing some kind of little benefits like that. But generally speaking, yeah, the climate is becoming more chaotic. I think there are some other things that I've noticed over the years. I would say that, there's more organic, biodynamic, natural wine being produced, which obviously is a positive thing. And in terms of techniques, you're seeing a little bit less new oak being used. You're seeing fewer small barrels, which have more of a kind of oaky effect on the flavor of the wine. And people are using stems, so they're using a whole bunch in their ferments, which gives the wines a little bit of a kind of different profile sometimes.
How about any winemakers that are maybe doing something that is just unique and different that you've seen that's not traditionally Rhône, to call it that?
I think, a lot of the change occurred like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So that's when we started seeing a lot of things which weren't traditionally Rhône. So that's when we saw a lot of the new oak, a lot of the Burgundy barrels, so the small barriques. People stopped using stems. And so a lot of that kind of new stuff actually has happened. And in fact, what we're seeing now is a return to the old traditions. So we're beginning to see people, as I mentioned, using kind of bigger barrels, using older oak, starting to use more stems, which is what, the destemmer only arrived in the 1970s, right? So before then, everything was a whole bunch. So people are moving back to that. They're using kind of other old techniques, like instead of punching down the cap of skins during fermentation, they're plunging it down and holding it down. It's called chapeau immergé, so immerged cap, which again is kind of harks back to the 50s or 60s, really. So I think what we're seeing is people going back to tradition, really, at the moment, rather than innovating, I suppose.
Very interesting. I think one of the things that's also really cool about the Rhône is that because of the incredible history there's so many other regions that have tried to mimic the wines of the Rhône, right? We think about Australia, we think about California. I'd love to just get your take on like the Rhône Rangers and the whole California movement of these Rhône varieties that honestly have been really popular in Paso and other areas just, in the last few years. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and there are some amazing wines coming out of California using traditionally Rhône varieties. People like Tapas Creek are making incredible wines. For me, they're not hugely similar. I guess they are similar to Rhône wines, but they're definitely their own thing. They're not. It feels as if they have their own unique identity. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting Syrahs coming out of California, which I've really been enjoying. And increasingly, I'm beginning to see more of this kind of savoury elements that I would kind of more naturally connect with the Rhône coming out of the Syrahs from California, which I think for me is a good thing, because I think savoury wines tend to pair better with food rather than kind of slightly sweeter styles.
I definitely agree. I think for me, it's been great to see American consumers who maybe were introduced to Rhône varieties through a California winery or, a domestic winery that they were comfortable with or had experienced a different wine from. And then that opens up their mind to try something from the Rhône and to, explore that region too. So it's exciting for me to see. I'm curious about wine tourism. So you lived in the Rhône for, was it 2 years?
Yeah, 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, for 2 years. So you lived in the heart of the Rhone, and I'm assuming you saw so many incredible places to visit and to see. If you had someone who, like myself, does not speak French and was going to
Uh,
travel to the Rhone, how easy is it to travel around the region? You know, how easy is it to taste in wineries? Is it challenging? And what's the industry like as far as building up wine tourism there?
it's a pretty welcoming place. I would say, you know, if you don't speak French, it doesn't necessarily need to stop you. I think there are quite a few wineries, and they'll have somebody who speaks a bit of English. And you know, you know, when I visit Spain, for example, I don't speak Spanish, so but, you know, I would still visit wineries there. I think quite a lot can be communicated in kind of hand movements and facial expressions. So I think you can still get by. And you know, tasting wine together with somebody is quite a communal experience anyway. So I think you can kind of share a moment in that, whether you speak the same language or not. What I would say is that, as I mentioned before, you know, a lot of these wineries, they're very small. It's just the family working there. So always phone ahead and book. Um, or, you know, and if you're nervous about phoning because you don't speak the language, write an email. You know, then maybe that'll be easier. You can use Google Translate, which is pretty good. Or you can write it in English, you know, and they'll come back. And maybe either, you know, if they don't get back to you at all, maybe you can assume they don't speak English, in which case you may not want to visit. But you know, if when they come back to you over email, you know, you can say to them, you know, I don't speak French. Is that a problem? Is there somebody that can speak English there? So yeah, always phone ahead. But generally speaking, everyone will be happy to see you. What else can we say about travel in the Rhone? Yeah, so you need to hire a car. So, and this isn't going to be a big deal for American people, but I think sometimes English people, for example, England's a relatively small place, right? So you can get around quite easily on buses and trains. In France, yes, there are buses and trains. They're not always terribly reliable, particularly little local ones, and they can go like maybe once or twice a day. So you need a car. Definitely rent a car. And a good base, if you're visiting the Southern Rhone, would be Avignon. So Avignon is a beautiful city. It has great restaurants and is very much kind of at the heart of the Southern Rhone. It also has a TGV stop. So it's good to get around the rest of France, rest of Europe. So Avignon's a great place. And in many ways, the Southern Rhone is kind of more tourist friendly anyway. In some senses, I would say it's more diverse in terms of landscape. There's more kind of sites to go and visit as well. And it's a little bit more geared up for winery visits. The north it's smaller. It can be a little bit industrial because, you know, I mean, the river is a major kind of way of kind of moving goods around. So there's not quite so much to do, I guess, outside of wine. But for the dedicated wine geek, yes, the Northern Rhone is amazing because the wine's incredible. And it's so beautiful as well. The landscape is extraordinary. But it's a little bit more for the kind of dedicated wine explorer, I would say, compared to the Southern Rhone.
Okay, that's good to know. I was so disappointed because I had a trip planned to the Rhone right before COVID and it got canceled, and I just haven't had a chance to schedule it again. So it's at the top of my list, and you're definitely making me want to come visit because it sounds beautiful. One region that we haven't spoke about yet is actually one of my favorite places in the world to drink rosé from, and that's Tavel. I love rosé from Tavel. So can you talk to our listeners just for a second about Tavel and what makes the rosés so unique there?
Yeah, Tavel is a fascinating little appellation. It's completely unique in the world of the Rhone, right? Because they only make rosé. So if you like rosé, they don't make rosé in the Northern Rhone. They only make rosé in the Southern Rhone. And Tavel is like the most famous rosé in France, I would say. If you're French, it's certainly, you know, very, very well known there. It was one of the 5 original wine appellations that were ever minted, along with Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So, you know, back then, even, you know, back in the 1930s, it was extremely famous for the quality of its wines. It's had a bit of a hard time of late because I don't know about you over in the States, but in England, I think we often, when people order rosé, they want it to be pale, right? Mm-hmm. And which, you know, it may look good, but I mean, it doesn't really make much difference for the flavor necessarily, about what it looks like. The flavor is more important. And if you follow the rule book of Tavel wines, because every appellation, every cru has its own rule book that you have to follow. They have to be dark. So there's a certain kind of color level. And if they're too pale, you're not allowed to call it Tavel. So it has to be a dark rosé. So I think commercially that makes life pretty tricky for them. But I still think the wines are incredible. I mean, I would say they have more kind of strength of character than a typical rosé. They have a bit more flavor. They have more of a kind of this minerality that people talk about a little bit. And the wines can be great. And there's been something of a revolution going on in Tavel recently. There's this guy called Eric Thiffling in Domaine Langlois. So he became quite disillusioned in the wines that were being made locally. So he decided to talk to all the kind of really ancient old winemakers in the village to find out how people used to make it, because it became quite a kind of technical kind of wine. So he really went back to basics and has been making incredible wines. And there are more and more people kind of following his ways, his kind of back to basics way of making Tavel. And for me, they're some of the most exciting wines in the Rhône now, these kind of new wave of Tavel producers, which I think are great.
Very cool. We'll definitely have to check them out and keep an eye on Tavel. I've always found the rosés from Tavel to be very refreshing, very crisp, even though, some, to your point, may prefer a paler colored rosé. Whenever I introduce them to a Tavel, they're obsessed. I mean, it's just such an incredible style of wine. And I think, unfortunately, there's that perception that the color of the rosé somehow impacts, the sweetness factor or, the overall flavor.
Yeah,
And it doesn't, right? And so I think that we can help educate consumers that really you have to taste the wine. There's so much more that can go into it, and it has nothing to do with the sweetness level. I think it can really make a big difference. But I'm a huge fan of Tavel. I love that region, love those wines. So I'm glad that you do as well. So Matt, one other region that I would love to ask you about is just Gigondas. Obviously, another really well-known cru in the Rhône. So can you tell us a bit about Gigondas?
Yeah, so Gigondas, it's not far from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and it's the other kind of very well-known cru, I suppose, in the Southern Rhône. It's not as well-known as Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but it's kind of coming up now these days, I think, in its renown. And because it's quite close to Châteauneuf-du-Pape and they grow similar grape varieties, often people kind of speak about Gigondas in the same way as Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but in fact, the terroir, right, is completely and utterly different. So Châteauneuf-du-Pape, very flat, close to the river, not much altitude, so it's kind of gently rolling hills, but pretty much flat. So very much open to the sun, open to the wind. And in terms of grape varieties, they tend to be Grenache blends, but there's loads of grape varieties they can use. So Gigondas, it may not be far away. So I don't know, what is it, like 20 miles away? So it's towards the mountains. And the village of Gigondas itself is, for me, the most beautiful village in the whole of the Rhône. So if you're going to visit the Rhône, make sure you go to Gigondas. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's also a great spot for kind of seeing the rest of the Rhône as well. So from Gigondas, it's on a hill, right? So it's in kind of the foothills of Mont Ventoux. And so from there, you can see Queyranne, you can see Rasteau, you can see Plan de Dieu. So it's a great place to kind of center yourself, locate yourself. But the wines are very, very different. So they benefit from the altitude. So it's a much kind of fresher kind of climate, generally speaking. And it's more of a kind of northwest facing. So the village faces northwest, a lot of the vineyards face northwest, so they don't get sun in the morning so much. And so stylistically, they're very much different. So for me, they're a little bit tenser, they're a little bit kind of, they give a little bit more kind of bound up energy in the wines, I find, compared to Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which are very opulent, very rich. So they have often a slight sense of freshness to them. So generally speaking, Gigondas is red. They're allowed to make rosé, so they make a tiny bit of rosé. And soon they're going to change the rule book, which means they can also make white wines, which I think makes a lot of sense because, they're up here in the mountains, it's quite a lot of fresh terroir, and it's the kind of thing it's exactly the kind of place where you would want to make white wines, to have this kind of sense of tension in the wines, this freshness from the altitude. And they tend to be quite a bit cheaper than Châteauneuf-du-Pape as well. But for me, very consistent, high quality, very age-worthy wines, and well worth visiting as well.
It sounds like what makes the Rhone so complicated, having all these different varieties compared to, say, like a Burgundy, where we can make it a bit more simple. But it sounds like what makes it more complicated honestly opens up the door for more creativity from the winemakers, right? They're not as limited. So there's so much opportunity for them to be able to make a red, make a white, make a different blend, right? So do you find that the winemakers kind of want to have their own unique style and they want to find something that's different than their neighbor? Or is it that, they're used to a tradition of doing things a certain way, and so many of them may have similar blends?
Yeah, it depends where we're talking about. I mean, Chateauneuf, there's more leeway in terms of the varieties you can use and the amounts in the blend you can use. But I think going back to the idea of terroir, which is essentially every place is different. So every wine, from a different place will necessarily be different and, be kind of linked to that place. So even, within an appellation like Gigondas, there are some vineyards kind of a little bit higher up, some more on the slope, some more flatter ground. And there's some sandy areas, there's some clay limestone. So there will be natural diversity within each of these appellations as well. But you're right, having so many different grape varieties to choose from does kind of give people a bit more creativity, I suppose. So blending, is a big part of the culture, and it's a big part of the skill of the winemaker in the south. Whereas in the north, if you're making red wine, you're just making Syrah. So, however, I would say that if you're just working with one grape variety, it makes the wines a bit easier to read. So you tend to be able to kind of get a direct view of kind of how the wine was made and where it was grown compared to wines which are blended. So in some ways, there's more of the hand of the maker in a blended wine compared to a single variety wine.
That's awesome. So in summary, I feel like for our listeners, the Rhone is an incredible place to explore, and they're just going to have to explore a lot of different styles from the northern, from the southern, just to be able to try what's out there. Because compared to a lot of other regions in France and around the world, there's a lot to try. There's a lot to explore in this region. But hopefully this was just a really great snapshot for our listeners. You should look more for out of the Rhone, what they can check out, and just a little overview. So thank you so much for your time, Matt. This was incredible. And once again, thank you for your amazing book. I know you put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, spending a lot of research, moving your family to the Rhone to be able to write that incredible resource for wine enthusiasts. So if folks wanted to learn more about you, can you give us just a quick plug for your book, your website, and where folks can get connected with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, so if you want to get a copy of my book, if you want a signed copy or you want a message in it, if you're giving it as a gift, if you go onto my website, which is mattwalls.co.uk, then I can just ship to anywhere in the world. However, if you really want it in a hurry, or if it's more convenient for you, you can get it from independent bookshops in the UK, you can get it from Amazon. So it's reasonably easy to get hold of. I'm also quite active on Twitter. I'm at mattwallswine. Or on Instagram, I'm Mr. Matt Walls. So you can contact me there with any of your kind of wine questions. And thank you for your kind comments about the book. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. And thanks for having me on the show.
Of course. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll be able to stay connected and keep an eye out for all of your exciting new Rhône event. Of course. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll be able to stay connected and keep an eye out for all of your exciting new Rhône adventures. I'm sure there'll be many more to come. I know you travel there often, and just appreciate your insight today. So thanks for coming on the show.
Amazing. Thank you, Sarah.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Matt Walls. If you learned something new, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you catch all the upcoming Wine CEO podcast content. If you have any questions about this episode or wine in general, don't hesitate to send me an email, sarah@thewineceo.com, or send me a note on Instagram @thewineceo. I would be very happy to answer any questions you have or talk about a topic on an upcoming podcast episode. Until next week, friends, drink something new and delicious, and I will catch you all next Wednesday on the Wine CEO podcast.